Thanks to all of you for joining us here today. I suppose it's lunchtime where you are. It's morning here in Washington, D.C. Um, as Emra mentioned, I'm the inaugural director of the Countering Anti-Semitism Lab at the USC Shoah Foundation. We're a new initiative that's tasked to develop applied research to try to build an evidence base of effective means to prevent and reduce anti-Semitism, both online and offline. I'm a media and communications scholar by training, so that's going to be the focus of the talk today. We're going to look a little bit at why and how that promise of the internet that Emra mentioned, where there seemed to be so much optimism, and there were even some very significant successes in terms of building democracies via online activism. How did that go sour? How did that change into the set of circumstances that we now recognize as certainly a crisis in the United States and potentially a bit of a crisis elsewhere? This is a global issue. This touches on global governance, the differences and distinctions between both industry policy and government policy around the world. So it's a large topic and it's a very complex topic, and I'm only going to have time to touch on the biggest issues, sort of to scratch the surface. But I think it will give us, I hope it will give us something to think about. Um, Now, the history of digital communication can be summarized kind of crudely as a journey from technological and regulatory consolidation into distribution and then back to centralized consolidation. First, we move from those earliest networks of the internet that were owned by governments, overseen by governments, very frequently connected to the military. And from there, we move towards greater private ownership in the 1990s, the so-called open internet. This process gave rise to what are known as the walled garden style of internet platforms. This is characterized by services like iMode, Vodafone, America Online. And those services tended to be restrictive. They tended to be proprietary and non-interoperable. So you would log on, you would have sort of a menu of things that you could do that was dictated by the service, but you generally didn't have access to the broader open web, and you certainly didn't have the ability to create your own niche platforms within platforms the way you do today. So you could easily access content within the walled garden, but you couldn't easily access the open web itself. These walled gardens were not perfect by any means. They maintained a great deal of control over the channels that they did make accessible to their users, and actually that did have a lot of positive outcomes from the perspective of safety and from the perspective of preventing these platforms becoming a location where bad actors could congregate and organize. Again, things were not perfect. Bad actors did congregate and organize. However, there was more oversight possible just based on the design and the engineering. Um, so, as a matter of private policy, for example, America Online would never sanction a dedicated neo-Nazi chat channel. And to a limited degree, they made attempts to curb neo-Nazi activity in their normal sanctioned channels. So if they had a politics chat and it was being overrun by bad actors spreading hateful messages or mis and disinformation, they frequently would make moves to clean that up. Now, again, this was not perfect, and I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture of this period because these kinds of cleanups tended to be reactive. By necessity, they couldn't address all of the problems. And of course, there was always a profit motive. When the cost of cleaning things up outweighed the cost of not cleaning things up, then the balance tipped back in favor of doing nothing. Um, but further, as a matter of public policy, walled gardens gave governments a greater ability to regulate these services. It was more just technically feasible because they were large and bounded entities that could be subject to sanction. A very good example of this in 1995 in Germany, authorities in Bavaria were able to prosecute CompuServe USA, which was operating there, for hosting racist and National Socialist content, as well as child sexual abuse materials. So, in other words, there's someone to go after. Someone owns the place where these bad things are happening. So you have an object of legal action, and this offers us the ability to police what's happening. And it's necessary to police these spaces because illegal and dangerous activity does occur on them. But that dispensation, if you want to call it that, that sort of order, the age of the walled gardens dissolved. And it dissolved mostly due to the increased effectiveness of search engines. This was probably in the late 90s to early 2000s. Search engines like Google had made open web access very user friendly. People would be able to search for and access services on the open web. Walled gardens, instead of becoming an easy pathway online for a casual, maybe not very tech savvy user, they became an impediment. And so people wanted increased access to the open web, and the market responded accordingly. This age of the walled garden kind of begins to fade, to recede into the background. And here we see a very significant shift in regulation and enforcement that affects these topics of hate, targeted violence, and so on. Um, Government regulation continued to operate more or less consistently at the national level. There really wasn't a huge change. There were no big changes in government policies. American speech law here in the United States, notably the First Amendment, continued to govern the American internet, what could and couldn't be said there, and so on. In Germany, laws like Section 130 continued to govern internet speech as it was accessed there, where you all are, and so on and so forth. However, this is where the design and engineering and the technological capabilities really come in. Enforcement faced significant technological hurdles during this period. Of course, Holocaust denial was still illegal in Germany, but site blocking technology was generally not sophisticated enough to be very effective at preventing people from accessing that kind of material if it were hosted abroad. So in many ways, we can kind of think of this period in the late 90s through the early 2000s, this period of the open web. Um, the availability of hate content during this period kind of becomes determined in large part in many locations, not everywhere, not always, but by the lowest common denominator standard that was set by the United States. Um, Something to bear in mind. But that dispensation, that order, also began to recede to the background. It began to fade with the advent of social media in the mid 2000s. Now, unlike the walled gardens, which did more or less disappear, the open web remained a vast and accessible and very well trafficked reservoir of material that people increasing, but in spite of that, I should say, people increasingly gravitated toward quasi-walled gardens like Facebook or Twitter or so on. And in contrast to those early walled gardens, like America Online or Vodafone's services, uh, these platforms, these social media platforms, were very easily interoperable with the open web. It was trivially easy. It was baked into the design that people could be able to click a link, go to the open web, and return if they wanted to. Now, there were design choices that tried to make the feed addictive, that tried to discourage this. But the point is that this new design and engineering arrangement helped to spread propaganda, such as the Great Replacement Theory, an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, because users could encounter a suggestion that they go off to the open web to read about it, and they could return, they could talk about it. There was emotional engagement that incentivized them to interact with this kind of content through the advent of likes and shares and things like that. If I can digress for just a moment, I have a good friend who's a social psychologist, and he was explaining to me that this is actually a moment where we made a design, not we, the social media companies made a design choice that actually that seems trivial, but actually had really profound impacts. He told me, when we have the option to like something, we think about things in emotional terms. Does this make me feel good? Does it make me feel bad? And that's what the like button does. But what if there had been a button that said, what if there were some kind of credibility button? This button, this story makes sense to me. This story makes me suspicious. That in turn would trigger our cognitive reflexes rather than our emotional reflexes. Think about what a different situation we might be in if that had been the design choice that we had taken. It probably wouldn't have been as lucrative. It's probably one of the reasons why it wasn't taken. But it's something to consider. Anyway, I distracted myself there. Anyway, the ability to spread propaganda is supported by this specific new design and engineering arrangement. And furthermore, users were afforded a very easy ability to form both open and closed affinity groups that in the early days and continuing on for quite some time had effectively no oversight at all. That made them ideal environments for radicalization. I don't want to get too deep into it. I imagine that everyone on this call is quite familiar with the radicalization journey and the paths it frequently takes. But one model that I find very effective thinks about radicalization as a process of considering identities, ideologies, looking for ways of satisfying one's emotional and social needs or one's grievances. So a kind of period of consideration and searching, then a period of encountering different materials, finding the materials that scratch that itch, so to speak, that meet those grievances. And then at that point, there's a threshold that's crossed where a person moves into social radicalization. And this is where they join spaces and groups and they make friends with people who share these attitudes and share these beliefs. And it's that threshold of socialization where we can say that radicalization has really occurred. Once a person joins a group, once they change their social circle, that's when it's safe, in my opinion, to say that a person has been radicalized. And that's a very significant threshold because it makes it more likely that they will engage in dangerous and even violent activity, and it makes the process of retrieving them and bringing them back, de-radicalizing them, much, much more difficult. So these were ideal environments for radicalization because they had this ability to steer audiences towards hateful content on one hand, while with the other hand, they could funnel audiences into these more private spaces. So they could give people the materials to consider, and then they could draw them to this threshold of socialization into a radical milieu. That process was exacerbated by the arrival of algorithmic feeds. I don't think I'm telling anyone anything that they don't already know very well, but these tended to prioritize outrageous and emotionally charged content. Hateful content, of course, is very outrageous and it's very emotionally charged. So we find ourselves in the present state that we're in no small part because of those design and engineering choices that were made during that era, and frankly, the failure to adequately regulate them. That evolution of policy, both private and public, from that period, I'm sorry, let me back up. From that period until today, we've seen an evolution in policy. Policies have begun to try to catch up in many places, not everywhere. And that policy is both private policy, what the platforms do internally, and public policies, what governments force them to do. And if we look at the way that that policy has evolved around the world, especially if we take the United States and the EU as our two examples, it's a real study in contrasts. I think it's an object lesson, and I think in many ways the US is a cautionary tale. In the US, platforms were allowed to self-regulate. They undertook these efforts as a means of holding off government intervention. They didn't want there to be public policy regulating what could and couldn't be done, so they made efforts to clean things up and take the pressure off them, so to speak. Twitter and Facebook and other platforms like it undertook far-reaching initiatives to ban violent hate speech, dangerous misinformation, and this led to a kind of exodus towards these smaller clone platforms that tried to offer more or less the same service, but to a very niche audience. And we saw some of the consequences of that shift. The Tree of Life synagogue shooting here in the United States. I think it's fair to lay part of the blame on one of those niche platforms, Gab, where the shooter continued his radicalization journey, let's say. Uh, Google adjusted its algorithm. It narrowly defeated a lawsuit that was brought by the victims of ISIS attacks, who said that Google algorithms helped to radicalize the people who killed their family members. Um, American legislation flirted with reforms to what's called Section 230. I don't know how familiar people are here with it. Section 230 is the U.S. law that says that internet platforms are generally not responsible for the content that their users put on those platforms. So if I post my intention to rob a bank on Twitter, if I conspire with others to rob a bank on Twitter, that's all my fault. None of that is Twitter's fault under Section 230. There have been talks here and there in the United States to reform Section 230, so that's not the case. However, those have never really gotten out of the planning stages. There's been legislation proposed. It's never gotten very far. And an interesting thing to bear in mind there is the role that religious fundamentalists have played in calls to reform Section 230 as a means of making it harder to access adult content, such as pornography and erotica, but also as a means of restricting children's ability to access information about sexual health, LGBTQ issues, and so on and so forth. So it's a fraught topic here, to say the least. Um, Now, Europe had better luck, and I think that the consequences and the outcomes demonstrate that. I think this is in no small part due to a more sophisticated view of speech as a social good and responsibility. Web blocking technology advanced quite a bit from those days of the late 90s and early 2000s, to the point where it's possible now to prevent casual users from accessing hate sites that are hosted abroad. There are things like virtual privacy networks that can be used to circumvent that, but that's another topic. We see in Germany the Network Enforcement Act of 2017 that forced companies to take greater responsibility in removing dangerous content. And then, of course, we have EU laws like the Digital Services Act that are helping to standardize regulations like these throughout member states. So regulations such as these have helped to soften the impact of social media platforms' otherwise abandonment of self-regulation. As the political winds change, there's a combination of the ideological commitments of the people who own and operate these platforms, and then there's also financial considerations. And both of those together, that sort of pressure of beliefs and market pressures, have led towards a sort of return to where we were before this period of self-regulation, at least here in the United States, and in those areas where these platforms aren't mandated by law to behave responsibly. So the EU has tools to deal with that kind of reluctant compliance. The United States does not have any tools, and frankly, there's no political will for them at the moment. They will not be developed anytime soon. Some platforms maintain better self-regulation than others, but that's not always a positive thing. Something we're seeing in the United States as anti-Semitism from the left begins to become a more salient problem. A platform like TikTok, which does actually have okay self-regulation at the moment, is increasingly banning users who are on the political left and who are posting what could be described as anti-Semitic hate speech or endorsement of violence. Now, these people don't generally give up and go offline. They find a place where they can post the things that they want to say. So they go to a platform like X.com, which permits such speech. And what we have as a result is this kind of growing chorus from the left and the right on platforms like that that are presenting anti-Semitic narratives, creating anti-Semitic content, a sort of permission structure to believe and behave in anti-Semitic ways. It's less of a problem that we're going to see the left and the right collaborating in any kind of organized way. There's just too much hostility between them, I think. But the real problem is with users, people who consume content but don't produce very much of it. They're getting these messages from the political left, from the political right, from fusions of the two as well. And this creates kind of a totalizing environment that normalizes these positions and offers myriad different ways that they can plug in to anti-Semitism if they have those inclinations. So these contrasting states of affairs offer us two very different pathways into the future. I hope that the U.S. writes its course, and if it can't, as I said, I hope at least it can serve as a cautionary example. Now, I don't want to, I see it's almost 8 o'clock. I have a tendency to be long-winded, so I'll try to wrap this up quickly. There are alternate ways we could tell this history. We could focus on the shift from one-way communication to multi-party communication, the way that personal websites kind of spoke to the world without expecting a reply, and the way then that two-party and multi-party platforms like chat rooms, comment sections, and social feeds altered that. Each had its own affordances, its own risks, its own patterns of radicalization. Or we could tell that story by looking at the ebb and flow of these communication spaces' size. We had those mid-sized chat rooms of the walled garden days, the message boards of the very early open web. And then we had these more micro spaces of direct messaging. And then we had these macro spaces of the social feed. And now we're kind of back to those mid-sized or meso-sized spaces of Discord, Telegram, and group chats. Um, this is really something to consider. There's no design and engineering. There's no magic solution from a design and engineering point of view. Whereas those mid-sized spaces in the walled garden era might have created a lot of friction towards this radicalizing content. The mid-sized spaces of today seem to be accelerating it. Only this month, an American reporter broke a very significant story about a very large, I mean, we're talking a few hundred member group chat of American oligarchs that was rife with scientific racism and misogyny. And these are, of course, two of the most virulent fellow travelers of anti-Semitism. All of which is to say that this is a very complex topic, and we need to take it based on the facts of the moment rather than sort of broad caricatures. Um, and also, I think the point is that we can intervene at numerous points. Every design, engineering, and policy decision that's made offers us a chance to move in the direction of greater social responsibility or less social responsibility. And that's the context that we're looking towards the future in. I can future cast more, but I see it's 8 o'clock. I don't want to go too far over time. I don't want to break the clock. So I'll stop there. We can open the conversation, talk about the future, whatever you like. Thank you very much for listening.